#couple goals. Yan ang lagi nilang sinasabi. Perfect daw kami. Yan ang akala nila. Ay, andyan na siya.
Oh, yung pa naubos yung coffee mo. Alis ka na.
Ito ang kwento namin. We hardly see each other. Pag nagkita kami, mahaba na ang 30 minutes. Ako, papasok pa lang. Siya, pauwi na.
At ngayon, nandyan ka na. Di mapaliwanag ang nadarama.
Paulit-ulit lang na ganito.
Pag weekends, tinatry namin bumawi. Pero ako, wala nang energy. Lisa! Siya, buhay na buhay pa.
Last na, dali.
Paulit-ulit lang na ganito. Habang tumatagal, lalong humihirap. Ito na nga lang time natin, unahin mo pa yan.
Ito na. Wait lang. Sorry, love. Pakialis yung kamay, please. Sorry, love. I have to go. Dumating ang time na hindi lang oras namin ang hindi nagkakasundo.
Lisa!
Matt? Wala ka bang pasok?
Meron, pero hatid mo na kita tapos pasok na ako. Magkwento ka naman. Sa post mo, dami mo sinasabi, tapos ngayon wala.
Pagod ako, Matt. Pag ikaw naman ang pagod, di naman ako issue ah.
Pero at least kahit puyat ako, ume-effort ako.
Sa tingin mo, hindi mahirap gumising ng maaga para lang kitain ka? Kaya, naiintindihan ko si Matt nung naghanap siya ng iba. Nakakapanibago? Siguro, sasanay din ako. Masaya kaya siya?
Ang lalim, ha? Ano iniisip mo?
Masaya ka ba sa bago mong work? Di mo naman kailangan lumipat eh.
Masaya ako. Pero even if I wasn't, I'd still do it for you. For us. Oh, picturean mo muna.
Hindi kami perfect, and I know na marami pa kaming pagdadaanan. But that's what makes our love stronger and real.
Over the past 70 years, international trade has become freer. Trade barriers have been broken, quotas removed, subsidies eliminated, tariffs toppled. More countries buying and selling goods and services with other countries than ever before. And while some trade barriers still exist, and new ones occasionally pop up, many countries' leaders and diplomats are chipping away at them, trying to unleash free market forces and the benefits and costs that come with them.
Now we're going to consider the gains from international trade between people in different countries, and we're going to focus what's called comparative advantage. Well, the main difference is when there's trade across borders between one country and another, there's the possibility that trade may be restricted, unlike the restriction that might occur if you're trading with friends and people in your own neighborhood. Let's begin with some definitions that focus on this idea of comparative advantage. To begin with is simply what's called absolute advantage. That's a case where a country can produce a good more efficiently than another country. Comparative advantage is a different concept. It's really comparing not only the relative efficiency of producing two goods, it's comparing the relative efficiency in two different countries. Examples will help a lot. So we'll consider the United States and Korea. And we'll consider two goods. Pharmaceutical production could be a vaccine, and some electronics production could be TV sets. In this particular case, we're assuming that in the United States, 1 day of work produces 6 units of vaccine and 3 TV sets. In Korea, 1 day of work is assumed to produce 1 unit of vaccine and 2 TV sets. So you can see right away that the U.S. has an absolute advantage in producing vaccines and also an absolute advantage in producing TV sets. But let's consider which country has the comparative advantage in which good. How do we find out who has a comparative advantage in each good? Well, we need to consider that table carefully. Again, remember the U.S. has an absolute advantage over Korea in both vaccine and TV sets, simply because 6 is greater than 1 and 3 is greater than 2 in that table. We say the U.S. has a comparative advantage, however, in producing vaccines, these pharmaceutical goods, because 6 over 1 is greater than 3 over 2. The capability of the United States in producing pharmaceuticals is 6 times greater than Korea. It's only 50% or 3 over 2 times that Korea can do in the case of TV sets. A country cannot have a comparative advantage in both goods, so by definition, once you understand that the U.S. has a comparative advantage in vaccines, it must be the case that Korea has a comparative advantage in TV sets. Go to think about the advantages that might occur in terms of improving the gains from trade in this circumstance. Let's do this numerical example. So it may be that the unit of vaccine is $100 and the TV set is $100. They have the same price, so you can exchange a unit of vaccine for a TV set. It's 1-to-1. And how can the U.S. gain from trade in this particular case? Well, for example, the U.S. could reduce TV production by 3 units by moving some workers out of TV production and move those workers into vaccine production. With the numerical example, that would mean it could increase vaccine production by 6 units. Now, with the 6 units of vaccine, U.S. can go to Korea and trade for 6 TV sets. At the end, it has 6 TV sets, which is 3 more than it had if it was producing the TV sets by itself. It's actually able to consume more TV sets and the same amount of vaccines as it did before. So this is a gain from trade. Now you might think if the U.S. is gaining from trade, then obviously Korea can't be. Is Korea being exploited by this comparative advantage? By no means. Let's consider Korea, because Korea can also gain from trade. Let's see how it does it. Suppose Korea increases TV production by 6 by moving workers out of the vaccine production into TV production. But now it can take its 6 TV sets and trade with the U.S. and get 6 vials or units of vaccine. So Korea comes out ahead. It has 3 more units, 3 more vials of vaccine than it did at the start. So let's draw a picture. And in this picture, let's be sure that we remember what the production possibilities are. Let's assume to start that the price of a unit of vaccine for a TV set is 1-to-1. Let's assume that in the U.S. we have 10,000 workers that could be either producing the vaccines or the TVs. And let's assume in Korea that we have 30,000 workers that could be producing either vaccines or TVs. Now with this information, we can draw a production possibility curve for the two countries. And let's draw them side by side. In this diagram, we're going to have vaccines on the vertical axis and TVs on the horizontal axis. And let's let this diagram on the left be U.S. and this one on the right be Korea. If they were all producing vaccines, you have 60,000 units of vaccine. Now let's draw the curves. As I mentioned, if in the U.S. all 10,000 workers are producing vaccines, we get 60,000. That's the maximum that we can produce. If all those 10,000 workers are producing TVs, we get 30,000. So those are 2 points on the production possibilities curve. And indeed, as we move workers out of vaccine production into TV production in the U.S., we move down along that production possibilities curve. We can do the same thing in Korea Korea as well. Suppose all the 30,000 workers in Korea are producing vaccine. In that case, we get 30,000 vaccines, one per each worker. And if they all go into producing TVs, the 30,000 workers will produce 2 each, in which case we'll get 60,000, and that's the production possibilities curve for Korea. So they're different, and that's what the curves would look like if they were unable to trade. But now let's consider the possibility of trade. And using the curves, let's just suppose that the U.S. specializes in producing vaccine. Okay, so it's going to be up at that point producing 60,000 vaccines. But now if it can trade, and it also can trade at a 1-to-1 ratio, it can trade vaccines it's producing for TVs. And so it's possible now through trade to get out there to actually be consuming more TVs and more vaccines than the production possibility curve in the first place. The same thing can be true in Korea. Suppose Korea specializes completely in producing TVs, and it would produce 60,000 TVs, but now it could go and trade those with the United States 1-for-1 and get as many as 60,000 units of vaccines through trade. It shifted it out. Its consumption possibilities, if you like to think of it that way, are greater than its production possibility. It's almost like a new technology has been invented. It's not a new technology, it's just trade.
You've been watching The Benefits of International Trade.
Governance of global issues through international trade agreements. Ever since Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, the vast majority of economists have accepted the proposition that free trade among nations improves overall economic welfare. But does free trade really exist? The answer is not really. Even in the European Union, where there is a free movement of goods, services, capital, and people, there are still many barriers to trade between the EU member states. The EU is much further in its internal trade liberalization than any other region in the world. But most countries do also aim at a certain, if not free, then at least freer trade with their neighbors and other trading partners. How do they do that? Well, by concluding trade agreements with each other. Through trade agreements, countries set their border taxes, that is tariffs, as well as quotas and other market access conditions that they are willing to allow to products coming from other countries to their markets. These agreements therefore set the conditions for how global commerce is run. The actors of global commerce are mainly private companies, but as the agreements are concluded between countries, they are governed by international law. The world's arguably most important trade agreement, the GATT, entered into force in 1948. Today, the GATT is one of the agreements under the umbrella of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which is the only global international organization dealing with the rules of trade between nations. The tariff negotiations carried among countries under the GATT agreement have been so successful that today tariffs are actually very low, on average below 5%. Instead of tariffs on goods, countries' main focus is moving to other issues, particularly to services and all types of regulatory barriers that face products on foreign markets. For example, each country has its own consumer protection and product safety rules. This means that producers have to follow several different standards when selling their products internationally. Trade agreements are increasingly trying to accommodate these differences by setting common standards. At the same time, countries use trade agreements for geopolitical objectives to increase their power over a specific region, for example. In recent years, trade agreements have become the object of increasing criticism, especially in the richer parts of the world. While not all such criticism is well-founded, it is probably true that trade agreements could do more to tackle some of the most negative side effects of globalization. Among the key questions is the effect of trade agreements on labor, both in the source and destination countries of goods and services sold internationally. One of the key arguments against trade agreements is that they destroy jobs, especially in the more developed part of the world. Research does tend to show that trade liberalization does affect jobs in certain sectors, but overall they tend to create more jobs than they destroy them. That makes sense, as otherwise governments would probably not conclude these agreements. However, the problem may be that those people who lose their jobs may feel as they are left behind. It is therefore increasingly suggested that governments address these types of distributional effects of trade agreements by targeted domestic decisions through corrective tax and social and educational policies. There are also increasing demands to include labor protection clauses in trade agreements, to demand higher salaries and improved working conditions, especially in the source countries of cheaper imports. Similar demands are being put forward to include clauses on higher environmental standards in return for a better access to foreign markets. The European Union has started to include commitments to effectively implement the Paris Climate Agreement under the sustainable development provisions of its trade agreements. The EU has also announced that it would not conclude any trade agreement with a country that has not signed up to the Paris Agreement. However, these sustainable development chapters in the EU's trade agreements are not enforceable in the same way as the rest of the commitments. This means that they cannot be used as a basis of a claim in a legal dispute settlement between the EU and its trading partners. Therefore, even though binding, they may be of limited practical significance. At the moment, probably the biggest challenge and source of uncertainty to the international trade regime is caused by the United States. The US was for decades one of the strongest supporters of international trade negotiations and one of the key pillars of the global economic governance system. While there are clearly flaws in the management of globalization, the Trump administration has decided to tackle these challenges from a purely national point of view. Economists and the international community tend to disagree with that approach, as going backwards on trade liberalization is not likely to make people's lives better anywhere, the United States included. However, something positive in President Trump's attack on trade agreements is maybe the increased public discussion regarding these treaties. Trade agreements do have big effect on people's lives, and they should be open to public scrutiny. Such public scrutiny should, of course, be based on facts. The discussion should also reach beyond trade agreements to address how we can make our societies more just and inclusive by internal domestic policies. In times of environmental crisis, also the environmental sustainability of any trade agreements should be a top priority for politicians and voters alike. Thank you very much.